Hello, and welcome to Getting Started with Time Entry in Soluno. This class is all about how to enter your time in, so it's geared specifically for timekeepers. So this will go into a little more detail than our other Getting Started classes, since it only concentrates on the one topic of time entry. All right, to enter time into Soluno, on the main toolbar, click on Add Entries. From the Add Entries screen, we're of course going to go to the Time/Fees tab. For those of you who like to track your time with a timer, there is a timer column. Just click the timer icon to start a timer. And then you can track whatever work you're doing for your client. We're going to let this timer run and we'll come back to it in just a bit. For those of you who don't use a timer, then you can just add your time directly into the system. First, enter the date the work was performed. If you're entering late time, that's not a problem. Backdate the entry to the date you need. Enter the file the work was performed for. You can look it up by client name, client number, file name, or file number. Next, if necessary, enter the fee earner. Based on your settings, the fee earner may automatically populate with the assigned fee earner on the file, or you can select a fee earner. Enter the task code. Our default task code is billable work, but you could also enter as non-billable. For those of you who do electronic billing, you may see your electronic billing codes and you would choose the appropriate billing code. But all time entries require some task code. For the majority of you, it'll be billable work. Next, enter how long you worked on the entry. Whatever you enter into working will also become the billable. The rate should auto-populate based on the file and the fee earner selected. The amount is calculated by taking the billable hours times the rate. Activity codes are generally not required unless you do electronic billing, but they can be helpful if you want all your explanations to be consistent among your timekeepers. So if I enter an activity code ATC for attendance at court, it will automatically populate the explanation with attendance at court. If I want to use activity codes but don't want to see them on the timesheet or on the actual time entry, then I can just type the activity code in the explanation, hit the space bar, and it'll auto expand out to use the explanation assigned to the activity code. And then when you need to enter your next time entry, just go to the next line. Again, enter the file, the fee earner, the task code. Maybe in this example, I worked on a file for 2 hours, but I'm only going to bill the client for 1 hour of my time. So I can switch the billable to be 1 hour. Then I can put in my explanation. Again, amount is calculated by billable times rate, not by working. Maybe you would like to enter a flat fee. Again, enter the file. Put in the fee earner, the task code, leave the working at 0, leave the billable at 0, leave the default rate. For the amount, type in the amount of the flat fee. In this instance, That lets Soluno know this was entered as a flat fee instead of a time entry in case you run a report that you want to separate time versus fee entries. Now, this date is populating from my entry date in the upper right, and this generally defaults to today's date. Some timekeepers may enter a lot of their time backdated, and they might be a day behind. So instead of changing the date every time on the time entry, you can just change this date to the date you want to enter for your time. Then, going forward, as you enter new time entries in, they will be dated from this date. And that can save you a little bit of time. If you do that, keep in mind this changes the date for all transactions in Soluno as the user. So if you go to enter in an operating in or operating out transaction, it'll populate with this date. So you do want to remember to change it. I would only change this date if your sole function is entering time into Soluno. Otherwise, I would leave it as the default date and backdate this manually. Now this timer is about to hit the 6-minute mark, and when it does, it automatically changes my working and billable to the next 10th of an hour because the timer respects your rounding setup. I am rounding to the nearest 10th, so when it hit the 6-minute mark, it automatically rounded me up to 0.2. Now I can stop the timer and fill in any missing information as necessary. Now, at this point in time, all these time entries are what I would refer to as draft entries. They have not saved to the system, so they are not available for billing. To make them available to appear on a client's invoice, you must remember to save them to the files. The time entries that have a checkbox next to them are the ones that will be saved. This one should not save because it's missing 2 required pieces of data, the fee earner and the task code. So if I uncheck those 2, leave that one checked and those 2 checked, the first 2 should save fine. I click on save, and it does save those 2, but it does not save this one because there was not enough required information. As a timekeeper, you may have a certain way you want to enter your data in. So you can customize this screen a little bit. You can drag and drop the columns in a different order. So if there's a different order you like to enter your time in, feel free to drag and drop the columns into the order that you would like them to appear. That way, it might make it quicker for you to get your time entries in. Add or remove columns you don't use. For example, if you don't use the time column, then the hamburger icon in the upper right, those 3 bars, if you click on it, you can remove the timer. If you like to put entries on hold, add the hold column. Now you can put these entries on hold when you save them so they won't get billed out in the next bill run. Or add internal notes. So if there's notes you want to make about why you did what you did with a time entry, like why did I reduce this from 2 to 1, I could add the internal note here for my reviewers. So as a timekeeper, feel free to turn on and off columns as necessary. You can also set some personal preferences. So to the left of the date, you may have your picture, or it just might be a generic icon, but this is your user profile. If you click it, you can set your preferences. So some of the preferences you may change is, do you want to include the activity code and entry description? So that means if I enter activity code do I want it to auto-populate the explanation as well? With that turned off, I can still use an activity code in the activity code column, but it won't populate the explanation. This feature can turn off the auto-expand activity code. So when I type the code in the explanation and hit spacebar, it usually expands out. But by turning this feature off, I can enter the code and it won't automatically expand. For this setting, I can have it automatically assign the default fee earner to the time entry when I put in the file. So with it off, it's going to default blank. I put in my initials and it will use my initials going forward. But when I turn it on, whoever the assigned fee earner is for that file, it'll auto-populate their initials when I enter a time entry. Also, for those of you who like to run timers and you want multiple timers running at once, you can allow us to run those multiple timers. If this is turned off, you can only run one timer at a time. And if you try to run a second one, it'll pause the first one for you to run the second timer. And then remember to save your changes. Now back on the timesheet, if I start a timer after I turn the column back on, if I try to start a second timer, it auto pauses the first. If I enter an activity code here, it does not autofill the explanation. If I type it here and hit spacebar, it doesn't auto expand. So control your user preferences here under your user profile, preferences, and then turn on and off the features that you need. And now I can run multiple timers. If I put the code here, populates, code here, populates. If you don't need an entry, use the trash can to delete it. And remember, general rule of thumb, when you leave for the day, save any remaining time entries that you have so they're not sitting in the worksheet overnight. Though it's very unlikely, there's always a possibility of a computer issue that when you come in the next day and load this up, you may lose the entries in the system. Again, we've got safeguards to prevent that from happening, but there's always a slight possibility the loss of time entries by leaving them in the system too long. So always save your entries at the end of the day. In this case, if you see a message pop up like this, I just have a retainer threshold set on that file and it hasn't met it yet, so I should not be entering time for it. So it's just telling me I have to override that in order to put a time entry on. So since this one has not met its retainer threshold, I will delete that time entry until we've gotten our money from the client. We can import time entries. So if you have a spreadsheet that you enter your time into, instead of entering it manually here, if you've got a spreadsheet you're used to using, you can enter it via the spreadsheet. And then when it's done, you can drag and drop your spreadsheet into the import file box, and we can import your time into the system. The reset button will delete everything on the timesheet. These are all old entries. I don't need them in my database. So I can click on reset to delete these without saving them. If you're in another part of the program and then realize you're missing a time entry, want to quickly enter it in, you can use the quick entry icon to enter a time entry. Fill in the date you did the work, the file you're billing it against, the fee earner, the task code, and the explanation. how much time you spent working on it. And then when it's done, you can either save this directly to the file, so it will bypass the time fee sheet and go directly to the file, or you can add it to the fee sheet so you can review it later before you finalize it. So if I click Add to Sheet, it moves that time entry here. So I can review it before I decide to save it to the file. And again, if you're another part of the product and a client calls and now you want to track the time spent, there's a timer in the main toolbar. So while you're on the phone, start the timer. If you are interrupted during the call and need to pause for a moment, click the timer and select Pause. When you get back to your client, click the timer and resume. If it's a short call or you decide not to bill the call, then you can click the timer and reset it. Otherwise, when you're done with the call, click Save to add the time entry. Fill in the missing information. And then again, you can either save it directly to the file, or if you're in the middle of adding this and the client calls back, you can just resume the timer. We'll close this time entry out and start the timer back up. Or again, you can add it to the sheet, review it, and then finalize it later. In this instance, I'll just go ahead and save it directly to the file. You'll see it is no longer here because I bypassed the timesheet and saved the entry back to the file itself. So that is time entry in Soluno. If you ever need any help training-wise, feel free to reach out to us here at training@soluno.legal. Also visit our website at soluno.legal. Click on the Resources tab and then go to the Training Hub. From there, we have our live classes that you can register for. We have recordings of those live classes in case you can't attend one live. We have mini videos that cover specific topics in Soluno, and we also have our training documentation there as well. I hope you found this timekeeper video helpful, especially if you are a timekeeper. And if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you for your time and have a great rest of your day.